All right. I know the program for this said just generally Linux kernel because I hadn't told anyone what I was talking about yet. But basically, what I wanted to talk about is something that I hold pretty dear to my heart, and I'm sure everybody enjoys it, is getting lots of hardware. But unlike a lot of you, I don't pay for mine. I get it for free. So, and a lot of people actually in the Linux community are talking to vendors and talking to hardware distributors, and they might get contacted directly from them basically because they're working on a project or a bit of software or a driver or something that is related to that hardware vendor. And they don't know how to talk to them. A lot of this stuff happens out of band, and these people aren't really accustomed to talking to corporate people. And they might treat them just like a regular user when they should be treating them as a hardware vendor, and it should be treated more as like a relationship with a company as opposed to just a user that you're trying to help with a small problem. Because generally, these hardware vendors are looking to get more out of it than just a simple conversation. They might not have a company to directly go to, so they will contact the person most likely to give them the information that they need. Just a little background about me, just in case nobody knows who I am. I'm currently the kernel team lead for Ubuntu. I work for Canonical. The Ubuntu kernel team, we're about 5 right now. Not a big team, so we don't really do a whole lot of development, but we do maintain the kernel for Ubuntu for the 3 major architectures that we handle, and a lot of the minor architectures as well. So the types of developers that might be affected by this, that might be involved with different hardware vendors and things. Device driver developers, obviously, they're going to be contacted by vendors that would have something to do with the driver that they're developing on. User space API developers, this falls under the category of things like video APIs, video for Linux, USB user space support, and things along there. General kernel developers, even ones that aren't working on specific devices, might be contacted by hardware vendors if you're working with something like VFS or even just the VM, things like that might affect performance, that are sometimes hardware specific. You know, different architectures have different cache, and that might be able to be optimized better for that situation. And other places, other people that might be affected are toolchain. Anybody that's working with glibc, GCC, bin utils, to where they can do things that are more optimized for certain platforms as well. The vendors that would be contacting, and I've caught the whole breadth of this situation. ODMs, there's the vendors that are just making specific chipsets. They might not be the ones actually putting it on the card, selling it at the store, but they're the ones that are making the actual core chip that needs to be supported. There's OEMs, and it could range from system OEMs to like Dell and your HPs and things like that. And also just the actual peripheral designers. So anybody like Belkin that would put out a card or PCI card of some kind. And then platform it actually be considered OEM, but they're more along the lines of like Sun interested in UltraSpark, HP interested in PA RISC, IBM interested in their PowerPC, their cell platforms and things like that, might contact these developers and try to discuss with them what they can do about the hardware. All right, so the reason the hardware immediate issues. If they're developing and they test on Linux and cross a problem, sometimes they might have the internal knowledge to be able to fix these problems. Sometimes they might not. Sometimes these people, especially the smaller vendors, they don't have in-house Linux knowledge, so they just have somebody that's working with the hardware, somebody that might just be working with the Windows driver, and they're like, okay, I'll test it, and it doesn't work, so they contact the actual driver developer to get something direct with them. They're also interested in regular compatibility testing to where they can have their hardware out to people that they know are going to be using it on a regular basis, that are working with whatever code that they're interested in, making sure is working with their system. And that way they know it will continue to work. They know it will continue to get tested on a regular basis. Pre-release validation, you get a lot of vendors that are just coming out with something and especially in cases where it may just be falling under a category of a device that works under a generic type driver, like OHCI USB driver. It's not specific to any certain chipset. It's just a standard that's implemented. So they implement the hardware side. They may want it tested regularly with the driver to make sure there's no conflicts between the implementations to make it work. Another reason they might contact is just because they're lonely. And I say that mainly because I get a lot of contacts from vendors that they're not Linux specific, and internally the management may not care about Linux, but the engineers do. And they would contact people in the community just to touch base, just to find out what's going on with their hardware. Have you had any problems, especially to distributions? Have you had any problems? Do you have any bug reports? Do you know if there's any issues with our hardware? And if there is, they want to work with you. So this is a case in a lot of places where there's not going to be any official management or corporate concern about Linux, but the engineers, the ones that actually care about the product, that care about the thing that they're working on, they will want to know. And they can usually bubble things up back to management to try to get samples of the hardware out to these developers to do something with them. All right, so when these vendors contact a developer, somebody out in the community, sometimes they aren't actually thinking about providing this hardware to these people to test, and it's hard to explain to them why it's important for the person who wants to, that they want to help them to actually have the hardware constantly afterwards. Not just here it is for a week, send it back when you're done, whenever you fix the issue, but to keep it and have it on use for a longer period of time. If something changes in the driver, or if something changes in the user space API, if something changes in the kernel in general, they can test it immediately with that code. Especially if they have a lot of different samples of the same type of hardware from different vendors, they can do regression testing across the board and get a better idea if the changes they're making are going to affect things. Over time, they can test the pieces to make sure that nothing breaks just because of somebody else's changes, because obviously things in the kernel get changed without the drivers knowing about it, but the core kernel might change enough so that it affects that compatibility, especially in user space. This can happen a lot. Regression testing of changes in the code and things like that. And just because developers like having hardware. The more hardware you have, the better. And you don't have to tell the vendors that, but that's the goal. The people that I know that actually do get hardware from vendors, and there's a lot of people that do, they don't follow up on it. And this is really where corporations feel uneasy about giving hardware to the community, to developers, is because there's no follow-up. There's no long-term commitment from that developer, but they really need to. Keep in touch with the vendor, let them know that yes, I've tested it lately and things are still working. I have a lot of users that report to me about the hardware saying it's still compatible, or they reported a bug and we fixed it, we figured it out, or tell them we actually found out that there was a compatibility issue. Your card didn't fit the spec and we had to work around it in some little quirk to get things to stay working or to keep it from crashing or whatever it was that happened to happen. This gives the vendor a lot better feeling towards the community, towards the Linux community, because it is different than working with Windows or Microsoft, or working with Apple when they have these dedicated partnerships that are in place, so they don't have to know who to go to find something out. It's written in a contract, and they can kick some butts and knock some heads around until they get what they want. And this kind of thing, there's no guarantee. If they send hardware to a developer, that person could just fall off the face of the earth and never talk to them again, and they don't like that. So in order to keep this flow of hardware coming into the community, it's good if these developers, if you're getting hardware, to keep back in touch with them to make sure they know that you appreciate it, that you're actually using it, and there's some benefit in it for them. And that's kind of pretty much the end of the presentation. It went a lot faster than I thought it would. But does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have experience in working with vendors that they would like to share, or had any issues working with vendors that they may want to discuss? Does anybody here work with hardware vendors at all? I see one guy. I see one guy back here.
I know a buddy of mine that does, but not me.
Okay. I don't. Huh? Is anybody here a hardware vendor? Where you work?
I work with Texas. I work for Texas Instruments.
Texas Instruments. That's somebody I've never had contact with before.
Probably not your area.
Yeah. Actually, somebody I've never heard of working or concerning with Linux too much, but I have Firewire. Firewire I worked with Texas Instruments, the PCI Links card, right? Matthew Garrett's not in here. I'm sure he could talk about a lot. Or is Matthew Garrett here? I don't see him. Yeah, he could talk about a lot more about hardware and getting hardware than I could. So, any more? Yeah.
What is your opinion of things like the new UIO system? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Anything that's going to reduce having to write drivers after the fact, after hardware is available, is a good thing. If there's a way for hardware developers to write things that are more compatible with the kernel as it exists, then people can start using the hardware right away. So
you know what I mean when I say UIO?
I have a decent idea of it, but maybe you could.
In some system that was put into a recent kernel break, I don't know,
Okay, I was thinking something more along those lines of hardware. Okay, so what?
And basically, this is a sort of a little way of writing most of the device drivers for the user space, and then you have just a little stub in kernel space to service interrupts and stuff.
I don't really have an opinion on it because I haven't really studied it too much, but the things I have read about it, it makes a lot of sense because it leaves a lot less that's actually running in kernel mode, a lot less chance for locking up the entire system, and it should be more stability if you implement things like that.
Some people have objected to it on the principle that it makes it easier for vendors to have opaque binary blobs.
Well, at the same time, every time somebody brings up opaque blobs, they start talking about, well, you should do it in user space anyway. And so, it's contradiction in the kernel community itself about that. So, as far as I know, if somebody's going to take the time to write it and make it good and it passes the general, driver guidelines for getting stuff into the kernel, it's going to make it in. It's just a matter if they're willing enough to market it, basically to get some people behind it and get the code pushed into the kernel. If they get it in there, then it's just somebody's going to run with it. So, anyone else?
What's the flow for like an Ubuntu kernel? With how close is it to kernel.org, and how much?
Okay.
How many patches do you manage yourself?
All right. So a long time ago, I decided that the Ubuntu kernel should try to remain as stock as possible. And to do that, we ripped out a lot of stuff that used to be in our kernel tree that gave us a lot of delta from the upstream kernel. We maintain, I would say, a couple of dozen patches that we keep that aren't in upstream and probably aren't going to be in upstream anytime soon. A good example of that is the ACPI DSDT from a NetRAM FS patch, because people can override their DSDT from a NetRAM FS for buggy BIOSes that are never going to get fixed by the hardware vendors.
You don't want to push that up, or they don't?
We tried to get them to push it up, but it keeps getting kicked out because the argument is we don't want people being able to screw up their systems. The reality of it is, as a distribution, if we take that support out, we're going to lose users because they're not going to be able to use our kernel. So we put it in there, and SUSE puts it in there, and Fedora or Red Hat puts it in there. So when 95% of the users are getting it by default, there's not much point. I think they just really realized that here lately on the mailing list. I think it's going to get implemented probably 26 if they follow through. So, but so we've got a pretty minimal delta between upstream But we have also a lot of third-party drivers that we put in there. So I'm not sure if you consider that at Delta, we're not really changing code that's in the kernel, but we're adding a lot of stuff that wasn't in the kernel. And I'm willing to answer questions about Ubuntu and the kernel in general if you're willing to ask and if anybody's interested. Okay. I'm going to go get a beer from dice.com.